What's up, everybody? Coming at you from the house here today. I am here with a very special guest. We are in the savannah right now, hunting endangered servals.
What's up, everybody?
Oh, did you get him? Oh, what's up, everybody? Hope everybody enjoyed the serval hunt there. We're here at a beautiful brook, just checking out the flow. I'll try to keep it like this, and hopefully everybody's all right with this view. But anyway, we've talked about a lot of different things in ecology. I think the most important thing that I get across or convey is the importance of balance, and to understand that we're embedded in the world. We're not above the world. We're part of these food chains, part of these resources, and these things cycle and continually change and shift hands, and that's life, but we're a part of that, not above it. And I think that's probably the most important thing to understand or to appreciate here. We rely on abiotic factors just like every other thing on the planet: clean water, clean air, nutrients, and as long as we take care of things, these things have provided for a tremendous amount of time all the organisms of the planet, and we're certainly an inclusive part of that. Without further ado, today I really just wanted to get across some conservation ecology principles with everybody, and try to make sure that you understand the state of things in the world, and you're able to be knowledgeable about these things moving forward. So conservation ecology is all about trying to maintain, I would say is probably the most appropriate terminology, maintain biodiversity on the planet. Things have gone extinct naturally. I think that's something that's important to convey. But when we look at things in its current state, 99% of all of the organisms that have ever been alive on this planet now are extinct. That means they no longer exist. Sometimes you'll hear me use the term extirpated. That means completely removed from an area, but they do exist elsewhere in the world. And there is undoubtedly a connection with human beings to some of our extinction rates. You can look at many resources online, and pretty well established connection there. I think humans have done a lot to try to help species from going extinct as well. Okay, so I'd like to make sure that we're aware of that. In terms of threats to biodiversity, really, that's the first place I want to kind of jump off here. And the number one threat to biodiversity, regardless of how we want to split it up, is habitat loss. Okay, so like right now we're in a beautiful habitat, and these things are becoming less and less abundant. We require more and more resources for housing and for food and for just the raw goods that are required to keep us alive. The tree harvesting out of state forest land and things like this continually increasing, and so there's less and less space that's allocated for natural settings, and some organisms don't do as well with that scenario. Other organisms thrive in these kind of pocket lands and early successional habitats that humans create, but that's another story. Number one threat to biodiversity is definitely habitat loss. You can chunk that in with pollution. Pollution obviously degrades habitat. Land has been fragmented. You'll hear that term a lot, meaning it's cut into smaller pieces. But all of these things collectively, in my mind, are habitat loss. They're fragmented, they're polluted, they're not the pristine habitats that existed thousands of years ago, and they probably will never be the same. These are things that are real. Other threats to biodiversity that are worth noting, the next one is invasives. Invasives, you guys, the world is connected so much today. One plane ride and you guys see how a disease can spread around the world with this latest pandemic. But same is true for organisms. There's lots of things that kind of travel with humans. You think about rats on every continent, and some of these other species like the brown tree snake in Guam, or some of the beetles that come in firewood or crates and things that really have decimated our forests. Invasive species, they come into an area, they don't have natural predators. Our predators have to learn the new species, and you know, sometimes they really can wreak havoc on an ecosystem and displace organisms, as we've mentioned before. So invasive species, really dangerous, detrimental. Think about the lionfish in the Atlantic. If you want to look into a good example, that's a pretty cool one. People release them from fish tanks and they really decimated a lot of our reef communities in Florida, South Florida, and some of these regions. But there's a lot of them, you guys. Lots and lots of invasive species, zebra mussels. We can go on and on and on. The next one, you guys, is really kind of cool, is over exploitation, and that's when we utilize a resource too much. You know, like, so we're looking at certain types of wood, harvest every one of the choice timbers out of the forest, and they're gone, right? One that comes to mind right now is the bluefin tuna. You guys know that one of them sold for over, like, I want to say like $3 million. It's just obscene. I would kill every tuna in the ocean for that kind of money. And that's what's happening. You guys might see the extinction of bluefin tuna. Another thing I just want to point out about that's really important to me, that I want people to think about, is the genetics of what we're doing. You know, like, if we remove all the biggest breeding females, like, what are we doing to the population's genes over time? We're putting a lot of selective pressure for those organisms to be smaller and smaller, and that's not really what we want to see happen. So a lot of places have put in slot limits where you can harvest species between a certain size, and I think that's you know, more ecologically sound. And those are the biggest threats to biodiversity that I've just gone through. I hope that makes sense. The last thing I want to point out about this threat to biodiversity stuff is, I really am not about saving every single species on the planet. I think some of them, they're naturally having a hard time, and there's a tremendous cost involved in it. Like, you know, California condors, those huge, they have like the biggest wingspan around. It's over 10 feet. It's absolutely astronomical, but I think it costs something like $70,000 to produce each bird that they've been able to produce in some of the captive breeding programs. I mean, to me, in terms of humanity, there's so many better ways to spend that resource, but that again is just my opinion. Some people would argue that, you know, biophilia, our love for the planet, our connectedness with the planet, we should try to save every species that exists as long as we have the ability to do so. And I certainly wouldn't argue that point, but I just think some of these things are just not cost effective in the real world. We have so many issues and so many problems. It's just one man's opinion. Okay, in terms of saving species, once we've identified them, I guess, like, a species can either be listed as endangered or threatened. Threatened is like less, you know, there's less of an issue. Once it's listed as endangered, there's a pretty critical chance that thing could go extinct. And we list these things federally. There's Endangered Species Act that was passed in the 70s. Kind of, if you harm anything that's listed federally on that Endangered Species Act, you got a big time problem. And then there's international laws to kind of help with some of the international trade and stuff. You can think about like rhino horns and, you know, some of these things that are traded on the black market and stuff, tiger paws and all kinds of crazy stuff. But these things federally have protection and internationally as well now, so that's really been beneficial, and I hope that makes sense. So in terms of saving some of these species once they've been recognized, there's a couple different types of programs that we have. Captive breeding is one. Maybe I saw like an extreme of that there with Tiger King, but you know, certainly zoos and things like that, people have their opinions, but at the end of the day, it provides a breeding population in captivity that sometimes, you know, these things can be beneficial for saving genes and preventing the population from declining to a point of no return. Along those same lines, there's a term called captive breeding. These programs, excuse me, I misspoke there. So captive breeding is a mechanism for us to be able to reintroduce. So captive breeding is typically tied into reintroduction programs. So like the black-footed ferret, for example, had a really big success. They were down into the single digits in the western part of the United States, and with captive breeding, they're back up into a sustainable population at this point. But you know, pretty much what you're doing is breeding them in captivity. You're trying to diversify the genetics, selectively, you know, pair individuals to maximize your genetic diversity, and then you're training these animals to be able to forage in the wild and releasing them back out into the wild being the ultimate goal. But all of these kind of programs really are predicated on there being a wild place for these things to return to, and that's obviously the biggest problem with a lot of this stuff. As I mentioned before, habitat loss being the single biggest threat to biodiversity. So in terms of the native habitats where these things originated, you know, preserving them, turning them into parks, conservation areas, really utmost in terms of the critical maintenance of species on the planet. And not only that, but in some areas, you know, like we were joking about it earlier with the serval video, but poaching is huge. You know, if you could feed your family by, you know, killing an elephant and selling its tusks, I mean, and that's a mechanism for you to get out of poverty or provide, like, it's hard to argue that, you know. I see that point of view. So, you know, having people there to protect some of these species is very important in some areas, protective services. So really what we have is, you know, protecting these animals, identifying them in nature, trying to get them to breed in captivity, reintroducing them into the wild, and preserving their space or their location. I guess the last thing is sometimes habitats are damaged and there's restoration activities that can be done to try to get the habitat back to what it originally was. And in the United States, we even do like controlled burns sometimes to maintain certain types of habitats to try to keep them early successional, but that's more of a restoration type activity. Okay, so that's really everything I wanted to get to in this final lesson, if you will. The last thing I'll leave you with, you guys, is this concept of sustainability, which I think is so important that everybody understands. And I'll just try to give you my opinion again. You guys really, I mean, I'm trying to teach you. I want you to formulate your own opinions. So please, you know, I know I'm on a soapbox a little bit here, but, you know, formulate your own opinions. Be knowledgeable and smart about these things, and you never go wrong, okay? So in terms of my opinion, sustainability, what I look at it as is, you know, we can use, and I want to be able to use the resources that exist on this planet, but there's a way to use that so that they're able to be maintained. And then there's just abuse of that, which I think is crossing the line. So if I go and clear cut a forest and remove every single tree that's in it and just, you know, mine the soil and remove every nutrient that's in an area, I mean, obviously, you know, we'd be able to support more life for a little while, but that's not something that can be maintained. I also don't agree with preservation, like just not touching it and leaving everything for nature. I think that's ridiculous. I mean, we're humans, we're on the planet, and you know, we need and require resources, and there's got to be some moderation there, in my opinion, my humble opinion, I should say. But you know, I really hope that you guys understand that concept of sustainability. There's cultures in the world that have been harvesting whales forever, you know, and they use it, and that's not what's killing the whale population, you know. They're using every piece of the whale, and that's part of their culture. That's sustainable use, you know. So I guess please make sure you understand sustainability, what that means to you. Preservation, I think, is the opposite extreme, and I'm not really advocating for that, but I think we should be able to utilize the resources that exist in the world and maintain them so that our future generations are going to have access to these same resources. So hope that all makes sense. Miss you guys. Take it easy.